Imagine a weapon so sharp it can cut a soul in half, yet so quiet you never hear it coming. The elders of the Ubombo Mountains say this weapon is not made of iron or bronze. It is born in the human heart, and its name is jealousy. They say envy is a thirsty spirit. It does not want to share the well. It wants to poison the water so that everyone dies of thirst. Long ago, before the white clay turned to ash, a war of this very spirit was fought between two women. One had the favor of the earth, and the other had the sickness of the eye. Welcome back to Silver Phoenix African Tales. Turn down the, sit close to the fire, and listen to the tale of the breath of the clay. Before the metal wheels arrived in the valley, the people of the Ubombo Mountains measured wealth not by the coins in their pouches, but by the water in their homes. In a land where the sun baked the soil until it cracked like broken bone, a good water jar was the difference between life and a slow, thirsty death. For decades, the undisputed master of this life-giving craft was Zola. Zola was a woman whose history was written on her skin. Her back was bent like a river reed from 40 years of carrying heavy clay from the riverbanks. Her fingers were thick, stiff, and permanently stained with the rust-colored iron of the local mud. Zola's work was honest. She built simple, heavy water vessels. They were thick-walled, dark, and entirely unadorned. They possessed no beauty, but they did not leak. During the merciless dry season, when the wind blew hot off the plains, a family could trust Zola's jars to keep their water cool. The villagers bought them out of absolute necessity, paying her in modest handfuls of dried maize or small bundles of firewood. It was a predictable, quiet life, and Zola took a hard, silent pride in being the foundation of the village's survival. Then came Kamali. Kamali was young, with skin that gleamed like oiled ebony and eyes that always seemed to be laughing at a secret joke. At first, she worked as Zola's apprentice. In those early days, they labored side by side at the riverbank, their bare feet buried in the cool, gray silt. Zola taught the girl how to test the earth with her tongue to find the clay with the least sand, and how to knead the air bubbles out of the mud until it was as smooth as fat. But it quickly became clear that while Zola worked with her muscle, Kamali worked with her soul. As the months passed, Kamali's hands began to do things Zola had never seen in her 40 years of labor. Where Zola fought the clay, forcing it into shape with heavy, brutal pressure, Kamali seemed to merely guide it. The wheel would spin, and beneath Kamali's light touch, the mud would rise like a living creature. Soon, the apprentice outgrew the master. Kamali stopped making the plain, blocky jars of Zola's house. She began to etch patterns into the wet clay, spirals that mirrored the currents of the river, and jagged lines that looked like the diamond scales of a python. Most miraculously, Kamali's pots possessed a supernatural resilience. While Zola's thick pots would crack if knocked against a stone, Kamali's elegant, thin-walled vessels could be dropped from a woman's head onto the hard rocks of the well, and they would bounce instead of shatter. Before placing them in the pit kiln, Kamali would close her eyes, lean over the rim, and blow her warm breath into the hollow belly of the jar. It was an intuitive, beautiful ritual that Zola watched with growing unease. The turning point came during the festival of the first harvest. The village chief announced that he required a grand centerpiece jar to hold the ancestral sorghum beer for the royal banquet. Zola spent 3 days and 3 nights crafting her finest vessel, polishing the dark surface with a smooth river pebble until it shone. But when the chief walked through the market, he did not even look at Zola's hut. He walked straight to Kamali's courtyard. There, Kamali presented a jar so magnificent, it looked as though it had been woven by the wind rather than shaped from mud. The chief was so enchanted that he did not pay in maize. He ordered his men to drive 2 fat prized cattle directly into Kamali's kraal. That evening, as the drums echoed through the hills celebrating the festival, Zola sat alone in the dark of her hut. She looked at her stiff, aching fingers, then looked out her small window. Through the dust kicked up by the dancing villagers, she could see the silhouette of the cattle standing in Kamali's yard. A terrible, ash-like bitterness settled in Zola's throat. The pride she had carried for 40 years felt suddenly hollow, reduced to nothing by the effortless grace of a girl she had taught to dig mud. The warmth of their past collaboration evaporated, replaced by a cold, calculating malice. Zola stopped looking at the shape of her own clay. She only watched Kamali's window, counting the invisible blessings the girl took home. "It is not natural," Zola whispered into the cold ashes of her cooking fire, her voice trembling with a dark, dangerous conviction. "No mortal hands can dance with the earth like that. She has bought the spirits. She is using witchcraft, and she is stealing the life from my old bones." And it was in that exact moment of black, festering envy that the seed of witchcraft found a home in Zola's heart. She's going to do something she would end up wishing she had never done. The human mind is a fragile vessel. When filled with the bitter water of envy for too long, it begins to leak, dissolving the boundaries between right and wrong. For Zola, the transition from a proud, hardworking artisan to a creature of malice did not happen in a day. It festered through the long, quiet hours of the dry season, as she sat outside her hut smoothing clay that felt increasingly dead in her hands. Every stroke of her thumb was fueled by a toxic rhythm, her eyes locked onto the distant gate of Kamali's thriving kraal. In the village, there were safe paths to walk when the soul was sick. One could visit the local elders, or lay a gift of white maize at the ancestral shrines to ask for clarity. But Zola did not want clarity. She wanted vengeance. She wanted to see the laughter wiped from Kamali's face, and she wanted the village to crawl back to her hut, begging for her heavy, plain water jars. To get a medicine that strong, one had to leave the light behind. At midnight, under the sliver of a blood-red moon that offered no light to the honest, Zola turned her back on the village. She walked toward the western ridges, where the red dirt gave way to jagged black rocks, entering the Forbidden Thicket. The thicket was a place whispered about only when the sun was high and children were safely indoors. It was an unnatural scar upon the earth where the trees grew upside down, their gnarled, pale roots clawing desperately at the night sky, while their leaves choked in the suffocating soil below. No birds nested in these branches. The only sound was the deafening, rhythmic chirp of nocturnal crickets and the strange, heavy rustle of unseen things moving through the dense briars. It was a place where the ancestors refused to walk, completely abandoned to the old chaotic forces of the world. Deep within the heart of the tangled woods, where the fog rolled thick and smelled of stagnant swamp water, sat the rogue witch. She did not live in a hut, but sat directly upon a literal mound of bleached animal bones, her body perfectly still. Her presence was a horror to behold. Her skin was texturized like deeply cracked river mud, and beneath the surface, a colony of living termites crawled and rippled, their pale bodies moving under her flesh like an active wave. Her eyes were completely milk white, devoid of pupils, staring blindly into the absolute darkness. Yet, the moment Zola's foot crushed a dry twig at the edge of the clearing, the witch's head snapped forward with terrifying precision. When the witch spoke, her voice was a double-toned, rattling hiss that seemed to echo not from her throat, but from the earth beneath Zola's feet. She did not ask Zola why she had come. She simply inhaled the midnight air, her chest expanding, and declared that the foul scent of jealousy always smelled like sour milk rotting under a hot sun. To the witch, that bitterness was a delicacy. Zola fell to her knees, her breath catching in her throat, but she did not run, driven by the dark conviction that had consumed her for months. She demanded Kamali's gift. She told the blind entity that she wanted the village to look at her with the same awe they reserved for the young girl. The witch's laughter was a hideous, dry sound, like parched grass catching fire in the winter winds. She mocked Zola's ignorance, revealing that Kamali's genius was never hidden in the strength of her fingers or the agility of her feet. The magic was in her breath. Every time Kamali sat at the wheel, she poured her own living soul, her very life force, into the hollow bellies of the wet clay to cure them and make them unbreakable. Reaching into the rotted animal furs draped over her shoulders, the witch pulled out a small curved goat horn. It was plugged with a rough wooden stopple and oozed a greasy, pitch-black ointment that smelled of grave soil and ancient decay. The witch placed the foul object into Zola's trembling hand, instructing her to smear the grease onto her lips before the next rising sun. She was to find Kamali's finest centerpiece while the clay was still wet from the river, press her mouth to the rim, and inhale. With that single forbidden breath, Zola would drink the girl's spirit, draining the talent directly into her own veins. Zola did not hesitate. Without a single thought for the girl she had once nurtured as an apprentice, she tore her heavy gold bangles from her wrists, the only wealth she had accumulated over 40 years of honest labor, and threw them onto the bone pile at the witch's feet. She turned and fled into the tangled darkness, clutching the goat horn to her chest like a prized newborn child. Behind her, the cackling of the termite-skinned woman echoed through the upside-down trees, sealing the terrible choice that would alter the destiny of the entire valley. The journey back from the Forbidden Thicket felt shorter to Zola than any walk she had taken before. The heavy goat horn, tucked tightly against her ribs, seemed to vibrate with a cold, unnatural pulse that silenced the natural sounds of the night. As she neared the edge of the village, the air grew still, the wind dropping to a dead calm, as if the valley itself was holding its breath, terrified of the medicine she carried in her hands. Zola did not return to her own cold hearth. Instead, she moved like a shadow through the tall grass, navigating the familiar pathways that led directly to Kamali's courtyard. There was no gate to unlock. The village had always been a place of trust, where tools were left in the open and neighbors guarded each other's homes. In the center of the yard, sitting beneath the pale starlight, were the fruits of Kamali's morning labor. A dozen large wet clay vessels stood in perfect alignment, waiting for the early morning pit kilns. Even in the dark, their shapes were breathtaking, the lines smooth, the etched tribal spirals twisting upward like smoke rising from a peaceful fire. But Zola did not look at them with the pride of a teacher. She looked at them with the hunger of a thief. In the center of the row sat Kamali's masterpiece, a massive beer jar meant for the king's upcoming harvest festival. Its rim was perfectly wide, its belly swell flawless, and it held the clean, fresh scent of the river silt from which it was born. Zola's hands shook violently as she pulled the rough wooden plug from the goat horn. Instantly, the suffocating stench of grave soil and rotted marrow filled her nostrils, making her gag. Steeling her heart, she dipped her thick, calloused fingers into the greasy, pitch-black ointment and smeared it across her lips. A terrible, agonizing heat flared up, burning her skin as if she had pressed her mouth against a glowing coal from the forge. She winced, forcing down the urge to scream, her eyes watering from the pain. Leaning over the great jar, Zola gripped the wet clay handles. She tilted her head, pressed her blackened, burning lips firmly against the moist rim of the vessel, and inhaled with every ounce of strength left in her old lungs. For a terrifying moment, the world went completely dark. Then, from the very depths of the jar, a soft, ethereal blue light pulsed into existence. It traveled like liquid fire up the interior walls of the vessel, gathering at the rim before rushing directly down Zola's throat. The sensation was overwhelming. It did not taste of the foul grease on her lips. It tasted of fresh ozone, morning rain, and the sweet, wild grass of the savannah after a storm. It was the pure, vibrant life force of Kamali's spirit, trapped within the moist earth. Zola sucked it in greedily, her chest expanding, her veins surging with a sudden, youth-like electricity she had not felt in 30 years. But as the magic flowed into Zola, a horrific transformation took place within the clay. The moment Zola pulled her lips away from the rim, gasping for air, the rich, dark, losing their form. Zola wiped her mouth with the back of her hand, leaving a faint streak of black grease across her cheek. She looked down at the ruined, ash-gray jar, then at her own hands, which were tingling with a new, stolen power. A dark, wicked satisfaction settled over her features. She turned back toward her own hut, stepping lightly through the dirt. Leaving Kamali's courtyard to the silence of the dying night, she smiled into the dark, completely unaware that the morning sun would bring a horror she could never take back. Thank you for listening to The Breath of the Clay Part 1. Subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss out on the consequences Zola will have to face for her actions. Until next time.